the most searched secret society in history. Finding material? That's not the challenge today. The real challenge is excavating the actual history from beneath 2 entire centuries of paranoid fiction. This explainer is going to show you a tragedy. A brilliant man built the exact wrong thing for the right reasons. And what he left behind? A ghost. A name borrowed by literally every paranoid fantasy for the next 250 years.
Ingolstadt, Bavaria, 1773. A 25-year-old professor sits in his office at the university where he has just been appointed to the most senior legal chair in the building. He's the youngest man ever to hold this position. He's also surrounded by people who hate him for having it. The Jesuits ran this university for a century before he arrived. They still run it in every way that matters. The libraries, the curriculum, the culture of self-censorship that has settled over the place like a fog. He watches his colleagues avoid certain books. He watches his students trained to repeat rather than question. He watches a system built to keep people small, and he is furious about it. And he is 25 years old, and he thinks he knows how to fix it. His name is Adam Weishaupt. His solution will last 9 years. The story it accidentally started will last 250. The Illuminati is real. It is not what you think. And what it actually was, and what was done to it, is one of the most important stories in the history of how human beings are controlled through fear of things that don't exist.
So, the central paradox here is absolutely fascinating. You see, Weishaupt saw the Jesuits operating as this highly structured, secretive order enforcing strict intellectual obedience. But his solution wasn't to fight them openly. Why? Because open advocacy for Enlightenment reform in conservative Bavaria got you ruined, literally. Instead, Weishaupt decided to build a mirror image. He built a hierarchical secret society dedicated not to obedience but to truth. He used the very tools of secrecy to fight secret power. Before I tell you what Weishaupt built, I need to show you the one decision that made everything else possible, and the one decision that made everything else inevitable.
May 1st, 1776. 5 men in a room. That is the reality. It wasn't some massive global cabal pulling strings. No, it was literally just a professor and 4 students in Ingolstadt. At first, they actually called themselves the Perfectibilists. Weishaupt took on the alias Spartacus, after the Roman slave who led a revolt against his masters. The other guys, they took names from classical antiquity. And listen, this wasn't just theatrical affectation, it was strict operational security, because if they were discovered, they would face severe retaliation.
So, behind closed doors, they weren't exactly practicing dark arts or plotting world domination, not even close. Instead, they assigned reading and classical philosophy. They demanded rigorous self-examination from one another. Members actually had to develop what they called moral firmness, which was the ability to act on your personal convictions completely regardless of social pressure. You have to remember, in 1770s Bavaria, teaching men that political power derived from the consent of the governed wasn't magic, it was treason, plain and simple. For 2 years, it was basically just a tiny reading group. But then, in 1780, Adolf Franz Friedrich Ludwig Baron von Knigge walked through the door. Knigge was a well-connected nobleman and, critically, an experienced Freemason. He immediately saw what Weishaupt's group could become. So Knigge aligned the Illuminati's structure with existing Masonic grades, and he actively infiltrated their lodges. And guys, the strategy worked flawlessly. Educated, reform-minded men absolutely poured in. They went from 5 students to over 2,000 influential members across German-speaking Europe in just a few short years. It's wild. But Knigge also saw the fatal flaw. Weishaupt completely refused to relinquish control. He ran this Enlightenment organization like an absolute monarch. So in 1784, Knigge wrote this devastating letter, explicitly calling out the sheer hypocrisy of fighting for human freedom using a pyramid of deception. The internal tension completely shattered the group. Knigge resigned, taking all of their organizational coherence right out the door with him. And the timing couldn't have been worse, because the real enemy was about to walk through the door. That internal collapse left them completely exposed. 2 disgruntled senior members defected and just handed membership lists straight to the Bavarian authorities. In 1784, the Elector of Bavaria officially banned secret societies. Then, in 1786, the government raided the home of an Illuminati member named Xavierswalk. They seized massive caches of their internal papers. The government then turned around and published these documents. They called them the original Schriften.
The weaponization of this was brilliant, purely because the documents were actually authentic. The context, however, was entirely fabricated. Look, Weishaupt was a professor of canon law, right? So his academic notes discussing things like poisons or abortion were standard legal and medical research for his position. But the government presented them as literal operational manuals for murder. Philosophical letters about natural law, those were suddenly framed as active blueprints for violent revolution. They took real, factual information, stripped away every ounce of context, and published the lie.
You are at the point in this explainer where most viewers have already left. If you're still here, and you are, that tells me something. You came for the conspiracy. You stayed for the history. Subscribe and stay, because that is exactly what this channel is. Every explainer, the conspiracy is the door, the real story is the room, and the room is always stranger than the door suggested. Ring the bell. Don't miss what comes next.
Here is where it gets extraordinary. Because the Illuminati was not discovered by a clever investigation, it was not penetrated by a spy. It ended because of a stack of papers in a dead man's house. And what was done with those papers is the reason you are watching this explainer right now. The Bavarian government practically built the very first modern disinformation campaign, and the blueprint had 3 specific steps. First, the selective release of genuine documents completely devoid of context. Second, attributing major geopolitical events to a group that didn't even exist anymore. And third, creating the immortality claim, the idea that the Illuminati simply went underground. This is absolutely crucial for you to understand. This exact 3-step blueprint, written way back in 1786, is still actively used to manipulate public perception today.
Let's talk about the men who executed steps 2 and 3. Remember, the Illuminati was crushed in 1785. But in 1789, the French Revolution terrified European monarchs. They desperately needed a scapegoat. Enter John Robison in 1797 and Augustin Barussel in 1798. These guys published massively influential books claiming the Illuminati had somehow survived and orchestrated the entire French Revolution from the shadows. The crazy part? They lacked a single piece of evidence. They just asserted it as fact.
And that brings us right to the fatal, circular flaw of the myth. Think about it. If you demand evidence of the Illuminati's existence today, the conspiracy theorists will claim that the sheer lack of evidence merely proves how powerful and secretive the Illuminati truly is. It becomes a totally unfalsifiable claim. Absence of evidence suddenly becomes proof of concealment. And an unfalsifiable belief simply cannot be killed by facts. It only grows.
Weishaupt lived for 45 more years after the Illuminati was destroyed, long enough to watch his name become a monster, long enough to understand exactly what he had built and what he had accidentally created. What he thought about it, at the end, is the part of this story that has never been told.
Spartacus ended up living out his days in exile in Gotha, protected by a sympathetic duke. While his enemies flooded Europe with best-selling books turning him into this demonic mastermind, Weishaupt literally just sat in a quiet room writing philosophical texts that almost nobody read. He spent his final decades desperately defending reason and human dignity. And you know what? He never once tried to start another secret society. He finally realized the instrument he chose was entirely wrong for the purpose he intended.
This is the core tragedy. Weishaupt wanted to free human minds from arbitrary authority. Instead, conservative authorities used the phantom of his destroyed organization to terrify the public. They used the Illuminati myth to convince everyday people to actively defend the exact corrupt institutions Weishaupt wanted to dismantle. They stole his legacy and inverted it completely.
Adam Weishaupt died in 1830. His obituaries described him as a philosopher and legal scholar. Almost none of them mentioned the Illuminati. The myth had already detached from the man so completely that even his death notice could not reconnect them. He had become, in death, exactly what he had tried to build in life: invisible. The wrong kind of invisible. Tomorrow we go further back, and further into the dark, to a military order founded in the aftermath of the First Crusade by 9 knights who volunteered to protect pilgrims on the roads of the Holy Land, who became, within a century, the most powerful financial institution in Europe, who were destroyed in a single coordinated dawn raid on Friday the 13th of October 1307 by a French king who owed them money, who left behind a legend so powerful that 800 years later, their name still means something to millions of people who know almost nothing about who they actually were: the Knights Templar. Day 58, the real story, which is, as always, stranger than the legend. See you there.